My ex's mom caught me staring while sunbathing. Can you help me with my back? Don't. That's what I told myself the second I looked up from my phone and saw her lying on the lounge chair by the pool, eyes closed. One arm trailing toward the ground like she'd fallen asleep mid-thought. I looked back at my screen. I looked up again. She was already watching me. You're the one who broke her heart, Diana said, without moving, without opening her eyes all the way. The least you could do is hand me my water. That was the first conversation I had with my ex's mother in 14 months. I handed her the water. She said thank you without looking at me. And somewhere between that thank you and what happened 3 weeks later, I made every decision I now have to live with. My name is Marcus, and I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a bad person who did bad things for bad reasons. I am a very ordinary person who did something complicated for a reason that felt, in the moment, like the most honest thing I'd done in years. That doesn't make it right. It makes it worse, actually. Easy villains are forgivable. People who know better and do it anyway are something harder to name. Here is how I got to that pool. Kara and I were together for 2 years and 11 months. We met at a graduate school orientation where she was pretending to take notes and I was pretending to be interested in the panel. We left before the second speaker finished. We got dinner. She told me she didn't believe in long engagements, and I told her I didn't believe in short ones, and neither of us was joking. For almost 3 years, we were the kind of couple that other couples looked at and either found inspiring or deeply annoying, depending on how their own relationship was doing. We argued rarely and badly. She went quiet. I over-explained. We circled the same silence for days without finding the door. When it finally ended, it was not because either of us stopped loving the other. It was because we had somehow, without noticing, become people who were very good at being together and completely unprepared to grow in the same direction. The breakup was Kara's idea, framed as a question, offered gently in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning while I was pouring coffee. Do you think we've been in love or in comfort for the last year? She wasn't being cruel. She was being honest in that particular way she had, direct without being unkind, precise without being cold, and the answer I gave, after a pause that lasted long enough to answer itself, was that I didn't know. Which meant I knew. We were finished by the weekend. I kept the apartment because it was mine before we met. She took the cast-iron skillet and the bookshelf we'd built together from a kit on a rainy Saturday, and I let her take both because I would not have been able to look at either without feeling the specific weight of losing her. I thought I was being practical. I was being a coward about grief. The 14 months between that kitchen and the pool were not dramatic. I worked. I ran. I had dinner with friends who asked about Kara with their eyes, even when they didn't say her name. I dated twice. Once someone who laughed exactly like Kara did, which I noticed on the second date and ended things on the third, because I recognized what I was doing. Once someone who was nothing like Kara at all, and who I felt almost nothing for, which told me something I wasn't ready to examine. I told myself I was healing. I was mostly just waiting, which is a different thing that can look the same from the outside. Diana reached out through Instagram in May, not a message, just a follow request from an account I recognized by its handle. A botanical garden photo, her golden retriever and sunglasses. A shot of a sunset from what I remembered was the back porch of her house in Clearwater. I accepted because I didn't know what refusing would mean, and I had never been able to manufacture distance with people I genuinely liked. And I had genuinely liked Diana. She was the version of warm that doesn't need anything from you. Curious without being invasive. Present without being performing. Kara had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and I had always privately thought the eyes were the better inheritance. 2 weeks after the follow, a DM. Marcus, I know this is strange. I'm going to be in the city for a work thing. Would you want coffee? You don't have to. I'm asking because I want to, not because Kara asked me to. She doesn't know I'm asking. I should have said no. I knew I should have said no. The knowing and the doing are the two things about myself I have never successfully connected. We met at a coffee shop near her hotel. She looked exactly the same as I remembered, mid-50s, silver streaks she'd never bothered to cover. The kind of posture that makes people assume she played tennis in a past life. She did not mention Kara for the first 40 minutes. She asked about my work, about a trip I'd once mentioned wanting to take to Japan, about whether I'd finally learned to cook more than 3 things. It felt like being welcomed back into a room I hadn't realized I'd been standing outside of for over a year. When Kara finally entered the conversation, it was sideways, through context rather than confession. Diana mentioned a dinner at the family house the previous Christmas. And I had been at that dinner, and we both knew it, and the sentence just hung there for a second before Diana moved on. Before we left, she said, I'm going to be in the city 2 more days. I'm staying at my cousin Marcus's place. You've never met him, don't worry. There's a pool. Come by tomorrow if you want sun. Bring a book. Don't bring any of the weight you've been carrying since I sat down. I can see it on you and it's too heavy for a Wednesday. I went because I wanted to. I should be honest about that. I didn't go because I was manipulated or confused, or because Diana had some agenda I couldn't see. I went because I was tired of being alone with my own careful behavior, and she had offered a version of ease I hadn't felt since before the breakup. That's where the pool was. That's where the lounge chair was. That's where she was, eyes half open, already watching me. We were there for 2 hours. We talked about her work, which was consulting for nonprofits in a capacity I only half understood, but found genuinely interesting. We talked about her marriage to Kara's father, which had ended 12 years ago in a way she described as mutual and overdue and not anyone's fault, which is somehow the hardest kind. We talked about grief as a process that doesn't follow a schedule, and about how she'd learned to stop giving herself deadlines for feeling better, because the deadlines just became another thing to fail at. I told her things I hadn't told anyone, not the dramatic things, just the quiet, persistent ones. The shape of what the past year had actually felt like from the inside, rather than the version I performed when people asked how I was doing. At some point in the second hour, she sat up and turned her back to me and said, I have a question before I ask a favor. Are you comfortable enough to be honest with me? I said yes. She said, do you still love my daughter? I didn't answer right away. She waited. I said, yes, but I think I understood something important that she understood first, and I think we were right. She nodded once. Then she handed me the sunscreen and said, can you help me with my back? I can never reach the middle. I want you to understand exactly what that moment was, because it has been misread, including by me in the hours immediately after. It was not an invitation. It was not a test. It was a person asking for help with sunscreen. What made it complicated was not the request. It was everything that came before it. The coffee, the pool, the conversation about grief and about Kara, the specific intimacy of being trusted with the honest answers to questions nobody else had asked. The sunscreen was just sunscreen. What my hands knew while I was helping her was something I was not going to be able to put back. I drove home that afternoon with the radio off. She texted that evening, "Thank you for today." I mean that in more than the obvious way. I texted back, "Me too." We did not define what that meant. I knew what it meant. She knew what it meant. Knowing and doing are, again, two different things, and for 3 days I kept them separate. On the third day she texted, "I'm leaving Saturday. I'd like to see you Friday." I'm not going to pretend that's a simple request, or that you don't understand what I mean by it. You don't have to answer tonight. I answered that night. I have thought about what I should have done, and I know the answer clearly and without any ambiguity. I should have said no. Warmly and honestly. And I should have told her that the afternoon at the pool had meant something to me that I needed to sit with, and that I valued what we'd built over 2 years of being in her daughter's life, and that I was going to hold on to that carefully. That would have been the right answer. That would have been the version of me I respect. I said yes. Friday was quiet. Friday was honest in a way that has a cost I am still calculating. I did not lie to myself about what it was. I did not perform, meaning I didn't feel or distance I didn't have. I was present, and I was wrong, and those two things coexisted without resolution. I found out about the rest on a Saturday morning, 2 weeks later, through a text from Kara that arrived at 7:43 a.m. with no prelude, my mother told me. I need you to not contact either of us. There are things I could tell you about what the next week looked like, and I will spare you most of them because they are not interesting, just painful. I called Diana once. She answered. She said, I should have known she'd find out. I should have told her myself. I said, are you okay? She said, no, are you? I said, no. She said, I'm sorry for my part in this. Don't be alone with it. She hung up. I have not heard from her since. Kara and I have not spoken. I am not telling you this story because I want absolution, or because I think there's a version of this that ends with everyone understanding each other and forgiving and moving forward together. There isn't. Diana and I made a choice that cost her daughter something real, and cost me something real, and cost Diana something I don't fully have the right to name, because it isn't mine to carry. The triangle we created has no clean exit. It has only edges. What I have been thinking about, what I can't stop thinking about, is that moment at the pool before any of it happened, when she turned her back to me and asked me to be honest first. And I said yes. And she asked about Kara. Because what she was really asking, I think, was not just whether I loved her daughter. She was asking whether I had enough love left to protect it from what was already happening between us. Whether I had the honesty to recognize what she recognized and the strength to say so out loud. I said yes to the honesty. I said no to the protection. That is what I have to live with. Not the Friday, the Tuesday. The honest yes before the wrong yes. The moment I knew and chose anyway. Have you ever been in a room with someone and felt the weight of every right decision you weren't going to make? And made the wrong one anyway? Not out of weakness, but out of a kind of terrible clarity, knowing exactly what you were choosing and choosing it with your eyes open? Have you ever looked back on a moment where the honest version of yourself and the good version of yourself split apart, and wondered which one you actually are? Tell me which side of that line you've stood on. I'll be reading every single reply. Subscribe so you don't miss the stories no one else is telling this honestly.